I'm Sandy Feldman. I'm sitting with my dear friend and a beloved friend of the congregation, Cantor Merel, our Cantor Emeritus. Shelley, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure.
You know, so many people at Congregation Beth Israel know a lot about your years here, but we really don't know a lot about your years before you got here. Can you start by telling me a little bit about how you found music to be your love and how you got to the cantorate?
Well, I always loved to sing, and I never studied music. And after World War II, after I was discharged from the Merchant Marine, I went back to college and began to sing in the college shows. And I began to discover my voice, and that turned me on to music. And I did some entertaining in the Borscht Belt and different shows. I wasn't sure exactly where I would focus as I grew as a musician. And then my brother and I, after I graduated from college, City College of New York, my brother and I opened a recording studio. And we had an interesting experience where we recorded auditions for La Scala Milan in the town center. And we auditioned a lot of young singers, terrific talent, who we came back to the studio to hear what they sounded like. And I began to realize what a difficult time it was for a singer to make it in not just show business, but in serious business. And then perchance we did a series of recording for a cantor in our studio of all the Torah portions and Haftarah. And he was a professor at the brand new school for cantors, the Hebrew Union College School of Sacred Music, and which I had never heard of. And he introduced me to the school, and I applied, and that changed the course of my life.
So what was your Jewish upbringing like if this was the first time you considered going into the cantorate?
Well, I was bar mitzvahed in a conservative shul, but it wasn't a religious home, really. My mother was a very ardent member of Hadassah, and so we were involved in the Jewish mainstream of life. And going to the Hebrew Union College was a whole awakening, a whole education. I had a student pulpit my second year in Rye, New York. And when I finished Hebrew Union College, I married my beautiful wife, and we took off for my first full-time pulpit in South Bend, Indiana.
Well, now wait a minute, because here you are in the School of Sacred Music. You've been a performer, kind of a Broadway performer until then. Did you ever kind of stop and say, wait a minute, what am I doing here?
Well, every cantor would dream of being an opera singer, and I did too. And I studied opera, and I studied with Boris Goldovsky, the opera workshop in West Virginia. And the big thrill was that the following year he offered me an active scholarship in Tanglewood. But by this time, Marcy and I had 2 children, and I didn't make the break, but I always remember that moment. But that kind of training, I think, made me a better cantor. I also worked in the Borscht Belt as a social director, as an MC, worked with some well-known stars, and all this was wonderful experience in dealing in a congregation.
Anybody who's ever heard you sing knows that that sound comes from a deeply Jewish soul. I mean, it echoes back 4,000 years. When did that Jewish soul start to form?
Part of my training, and then my first year in Hebrew Union College, every Shabbat we'd go to all parts of New York to hear the best cantors. And the greatest compliment that I could receive is when someone would say, "You sounded like my cantor in the old shul in New York." That was the highest. So I love the style of the Eastern European chazan, but it has a lot of heart.
Was that different from most of the other students in school with you?
No, we were all pretty much in the same boat. The interesting thing that class, we were in the second graduating class in the school. That was the first school to train cantors in the history of America. Following the Holocaust, it cut off the supply of cantors, unfortunately.
What year would that have been?
I graduated in 1952. I entered the school in 1949. And in my class was an interesting assortment. Some came from very religious homes, others came from opera, some came from Broadway, show business, and it was an amazing collection of talent. Since then, the college attracts different levels of singers and different kind of commitment. But it was an exciting time in my life.
Was there anything that stands out in particular about your schooling?
Well, the things that stand out, it was brand new. We were in the second graduating class. The school was developing, and we fought to get more and more, and because they weren't quite organized, and so we were eager to make the school better. And through the years, it's become a great institution. Cantor Bernstein is a graduate, and she reflects a high level of achievement.
So you're ordained as a cantor. What happened next?
We didn't get ordained. We had commissioned, and that's one of the problems we feel we should have been, and perhaps someday we will. But we didn't have that same level.
And then you're still off into the cantorate, though. What happened? How did that career begin after schooling?
Well, my first pulpit was in South Bend, Indiana, and then I went on to Chicago and I became a cantor educator. Now, to sell the idea of cantors in the early Reform movement, where there were very few cantors, the school decided they would sell 2 for 1, a cantor educator. And that's how I started out. And we opened up many pulpits. I opened up 2 or 3 pulpits that never had a cantor. And so for about 14 years, I served as cantor educator. It was a very pressured kind of double existence, but it was exciting in a way. And when I went to Oakland, California, to Temple Sinai, I was principal of a school of 550 children, plus a Hebrew school. It was very demanding, but very exciting, and I still was able to keep up my cantorial work. And I continued to do a lot of concert lecture recitals of Jewish music throughout Northern California and down to Santa Barbara.
Ultimately, you got a little north of North America, or of the United States anyway.
Yes, things changed in the congregation. I didn't want to continue as a dual role of cantor educator, and some dynamics in the area was changing. Populations were moving to the Contra Costa. And I had an opportunity to audition for a Holy Blossom Temple in Toronto, a congregation of 2,500 families. And my mother, may she rest in peace, always dreamed that I would be in the opera. So when Marcy called my mother to tell her we're moving from Oakland to Toronto, she assured her that this Holy Blossom Temple was the opera of the cantorial world.
What did she mean by that, do you think? Or what did you come to find out it meant?
Well, that meant that it had yichus. It was well-known congregation. But we had a wonderful time. Marcy developed her own career there, and we were there for 10 years through summer and fall and lots of winter.
Colder there than San Diego.
You bet.
That have anything to do with your coming to San Diego?
Good question. Well, after 10 years, Michael Sternfield, who was a student at rabbinic school in Cincinnati, and was dating a young woman from Toronto, and we became acquainted. And when he became senior rabbi here at Beth Israel, knowing of my work and reputation in Toronto, he called and asked if I'd like to move. And he called in the middle of the winter. And that began my association with San Diego and Beth Israel.
So you'd had a personal connection with Rabbi Sternfeld long before you came to San Diego?
Oh, yes, yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, when he was a student, he was dating a young woman whom he married, and I co-officiated at their wedding. And so he would come to visit the temple whenever he was in Toronto, and to him, that was an ace congregation with 2,500 families. The rabbi was Rabbi Gunther Plaut, a very distinguished rabbi and scholar, and he would always visit with me. And so we had a relationship started, and he admired the congregation. He knew the kind of work that I did, and so when he became senior rabbi, he had good taste.
How long had you been on the pulpit in Toronto before?
10 years. We were there 10 years.
Did he have to twist your arm, or did you just look outside?
Well, the winters were pretty dreary, but I did some very exciting things. I no longer was educated, but I ran the bar mitzvah training program, and I initiated the chanting of Torah and Haftarah. They had never done that. At one time in its history, it was sort of a classical reform, and then it became more traditional. And I was able to put on some exciting programs, commissioning new works. For a while, I was doing a new program every month. And I loved doing that, and I had tremendous youth choir, an adult choir, and as well as bringing orchestras and symphony orchestras.
What questions did you ask about Congregation Beth Israel before you agreed to come, and what did you find when you got here? How was it different?
Well, it was it was a step down in terms of size from 2,500. I think we had about 800 families here.
Give us the year again. Let's keep oriented.
1979.
Okay.
About 800 families, and it was like a little stiebel. But I was at a stage in my life where I wanted to leave. I wanted to leave the winters, and I also realized that I would never be rich in the cantorate, and I succeeded in that. And I decided that the style of life, and I felt that I had a great deal to offer this congregation, and to share with them the fruits of my labors and experience. It was a rough move for Marcy, who gave up her career, and she stuck with me, thank God. And we'll be married. We were married 56 years now. Wow. And Bashert, we came here with our daughter, who was the youngest, and our two sons we left in Toronto. And Bashert, they both settled in Southern California with their families. So
how nice.
It worked out well.
Well, tell us more about your family. Tell us what Marcy was doing in Toronto that you stole her away from.
Marcy, you want to ask her yourself. She was a social worker. She worked first as assistant director of the Volunteer Bureau of Toronto, and where they placed volunteers for various charity organizations. And then she was part of a startup group to service for people who are mentally ill, who were treated in hospitals and then discharged, came back again, recidivism. They wanted to stop that. And this organization started to work with all the hospitals and institutions working with mentally ill people, and to find out who was doing what. And her particular job was to set up activities, leisure activities, so they can help them to meet others and learn how to relate, and not to work themselves back into the institutions they left. And she started with a pilot program, and it was so successful, it was funded by Ontario, the province of Ontario. It became so successful that she started up several groups. And just before we left, she had started a neighborhood all week, a day program, which was unique. And so she did a terrific job there.
Tell us about the rest of the family.
Our oldest son, Josh, was in the restaurant business for about 20 years. He went to college at Rensselaer Polytech in Toronto, and he worked for Tony Roma as regional director, and then he was offered an opportunity to become a partner and opened up a Tony Roma in Temecula. And then they opened one in Villa del Valle in San Diego, and another Mexican restaurant in Temecula. He's since left the restaurant business, and he sells insurance to restaurants now. And he's a great sailor and has a boat in Marina del Rey in LA. And our second son, Daniel, graduated from the University of Toronto as a psychologist. He worked for an employment Manpower, and then he came here, went on to get his MBA at National University. He lives in Irvine, and he's terrific with computers, and he works for a firm that deals in health filing and records. I'm not sure what it is, but he travels around the country. He's doing great, and he's married, Christy. Our daughter, Judith, that lives here in town, she just became a paralegal graduated from USC. She's married and has a son who's 18. So we get together.
So you schlepped them when they were little to San Diego. You're at CBI now. What did you learn about the early history of CBI, the foundational history of CBI when you first got here?
I didn't learn very much at the time, except, I knew that an old congregation, the building that we met in at 3rd and Laurel, I think was by then about 65 years old. And I knew, of course, that the original congregation, temple, had been moved later on after we came in Heritage Park. So I knew there was a long history. I knew Rabbi Cohn, who I met him, and I briefly met the rabbi that preceded Michael Sternfield. But I felt it was a warm congregation, and what was most important to me was that Michael Sternfield was open to new ideas, appreciated what I did, and that gave me the encouragement to make greater contributions in terms of musical programming and the content of the services, the musical services.
I want to get back to talking about your relationship with Rabbi Sternfeld, because it was really the key relationship professionally that you had here at Congregation Beth Israel. You had told me a story not too long ago about one of the founding families and your connection to that family. Can you tell me that story?
Richard Levi was a long-term member. He was bar mitzvahed in the original building. He's about 91 or 92. I recently officiated at his wedding.
At 92?
At 92, just about 2 months ago. And I knew he was here, his family had been one of the early founders, and at that, he gave me a book that one of his nephews or grandsons had put together of the history of his family. And they literally started the first congregation in the middle of the 1800s. So that was fascinating. That book is available. And so now that we're looking at 150 years of celebration, that information will be helpful.
So you mentioned Rabbi Sternfeld. Who are the other key players, if you will, when you came? Who were the leaders? Who were the key congregants at the point that you came?
Well, Rabbi Sternfield
yes.
Was, Jim Milch was president when I came. Bob Burton was the chairperson of the Personnel Committee, and he's the one who went to New York to hear me, to audition. Because when Michael called me, I said, you have to go through the procedure with the American Conference of Cantors. And so I was in Toronto. I flew to New York, and Bob Burton flew there, and he heard several candidates, and Michael wanted me. I mean, he knew who I was. And so came here, had the interview. I did a service. I met with the board. And in spite of all that, they hired me.
So what are some of the standout memories from those early years when you first came on board at Congregation Beth Israel?
Well, the first thing, they didn't even have an office for me. I mean, it was like small town.
This is at 3rd and Laurel.
3rd and Laurel, but the congregation was very run loose. Michael had only been there only a few years before I arrived. In fact, when they hired me, they had to give him more money than I was getting so he would look better. And they found an office, and then they got furniture. I mean, they really was starting from scratch, but everybody was very warm and receptive. And I had a wonderful music director, Ken Fall, who was a beautiful guy and fine musician, and we immediately were able to work together and had a good choir. I started a volunteer choir, and we did a few programs, and I set up a bar mitzvah training program, which seemed to work pretty well for 10 years. And so there were, we sort of found our way in the congregation. We had sold our cars in Toronto, so we had to buy cars. We had to buy a car for me, for Marcy, and our daughter, Judy. And so this was settling in.
And who were the other senior staff members at the time? Do you remember?
Nadine Finkel had just started and started the Chavurah program. Helene Schlafman, of course, was principal. Alan Levinson was the executive director here. when we arrived, and he was a former classmate of Michael Sternfield's. However, he chose not to complete it to become a rabbi. And he was a good friend. When he left, Steve Makoff came. He had been directing camps. I think he was with Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And during his time, Rabbi Sternfield began the day school. Now, this was rather unique because very few Reformed temples had a day school. And they started the day school, and it went fairly well under Steve Makoff's direction. I think Jill Green was the principal, and then following Steve Makoff was Mark Greenstein, very capable. He organized the new computer system in the office, very bright young man. Mark was very effective. He went on to Washington Hebrew Congregation. He died far too young. And then Stuart Simmons came, and when he retired, he had been here about 20 years. And Stuart and I worked well together, and he was very instrumental in helping build this new sanctuary, this new congregation, this new building. And Stuart still lives in town. He's a good friend.
Well, let's get back to Rabbi Sternfield. What was that relationship like? How did it affect your cantorate?
Well, we worked beautifully together. We supported each other. We were the only staff. We shared visiting hospitals. We discussed the services and the high holy days. He was open to new ideas. We brought in, every year I brought in an orchestra. We did a Shabbat service with orchestra with David Amos, and then it was called the Jewish Community Center Orchestra. And Michael was very good. He worked hard at his job, and when I would do something on the pulpit, we'd sit on either side of the pulpit. Michael would give me a thumbs up, he'd appreciate it. And when he did a good sermon, I would give him the thumbs up side too. But he was good. We worked well together. We respected each other.
You put whole orchestras right on the bima.
We built an extension in the 3rd and Laurel, and we had a 40-piece orchestra. Did it every year for 10 years.
That wasn't the only innovation that you had in worship services. Can you tell us about some of the other programs that you innovated?
Well, I try to bring in the kind of music that you referred to earlier, the kind of music that are a reflection of the cantor in the old style, with taste and not too much repetition, and try to tie in the choir and the congregation, so that there was a constant interchange between the response of the choir, the soloist, the cantor, and the congregation. And the highest compliment I would get is, say, if somebody said, "Oh, when you sang that Hashkivenu, you sent chills down my spine." But it wasn't just performance, it was involvement. I think that congregation learned they can sing and they can listen, and there can be silence, and that's all the dynamics of prayer. So I brought that element to it, and I tried to show to the congregation that liturgical music wasn't the only thing, and that's why I brought in programs, because we had folk music. We brought, Nadine and I set up several weekends, a festival of arts, and we brought in dancers, and we had children's choirs, and I tried to show that the broad gamut. I did a service of Ladino and Sephardic music, like most cantors are doing that today, but I was sort of nouveau in this community. And every year I'd bring a church choir in where we'd perform a Jewish work in the synagogue on Friday night and Sunday go to the church. So it was a very exciting interfaith experience. We did the block sacred service. There were all number of things. And I was honored by the Jewish Community Center as Man of the Year for outstanding music performances, and that was very touching.
You worked with some well-known names in the music industry too, and here locally in San Diego at that time.
David Amos, who had conducted the orchestra, who is a terrific friend, and I also did a recording with him in London with the Philharmonia Orchestra of London of a work by Alan Hovhannes which we performed here, and then when he went to London to do it, he invited me to make this recording. And Alan Hovhaness wrote this in honor of the formation of Israel. He wrote it in 1952. He is not Jewish, he's Armenian. He wrote it in Hebrew, called The Shepherd of Israel. And when I also performed it in Toronto. And when I did it in Toronto, my choir, someone in the organ loft recorded it on a little cassette. It wasn't professional. I took the cassette and I sent it to Alan Hovhaness. Now this was in the 60s, and he wrote me back thanking me. He had never heard the piece. He wrote it, but it was had never heard it performed. And then, of course, we recorded it on a CD. So that was an exciting experience. Marcy and I were there, and it was exciting to take part with it.
So presumably the congregation here at Beth Israel hadn't heard this kind of music or seen this kind of work on a Friday night service. How did they react?
I think they responded well because it was done in the kind of things I would do as a service, like the block sacred service is a service. And then other things we do as a sermon in song. And then I would honor composers like Max Janowski, Ben Steinberg. I'd invite them here, and we do a Friday night of all their music with choir and instruments, and then they would give lectures on Sunday. So I tried to introduce that, and some of it we continue to use. I hope that people remember these things, because the liturgy is only one phase of it, the concert part of it, the folk. There's so many aspects of Jewish music.
Worship was only one part of what you did here. You must have done thousands of Lifecycle ceremonies, officiated at thousands of them. Any in particular that stand out?
Well, first of all, I set up a bar mitzvah training program. I made tapes, and this is before CDs, of course. Everything was on cassette. What stood out, I did weddings with Michael, and Lifecycle, baby namings, weddings, funerals.
What's the strangest thing that ever happened at a Lifecycle event?
Well, I'll tell you one, which Michael's secretary would tell me what time the wedding would be, because Michael did the counseling or arrangement. I would just walk in and I'd sing and arrange it with the organist. And I arrived at one wedding, and it had already started. She had given me the wrong time. Well, it was too late to go in. And so I was embarrassed. I didn't go into it, so I just left. It turns out that, and then several years afterwards, we invited a gentleman to speak at a group of men who we have lunch once a month. And he said, "Oh, Cantor, I want to talk to you after the lunch." And then he reminded me that his wedding that I missed, and who was it? Greg Smith, our assessor. That was the worst thing that ever happened. I was embarrassed.
Tax bill go up that year?
Pardon me?
Did your tax bill go up that year? Well, we're talking about wedding services. I want to show you a picture and just get your reaction to it. What memories does that bring back?
Yeah, that's Estelle Milch and Ken Fall. Now, Estelle Milch was the first chairman of the music committee when I came. And I went to the board and I said, I want to put this on. It takes I think a quartet of woodwinds and a choir. They had no budget for it. They were just beginning. And so Estelle spoke up, and Rick Barrett was also helpful then. He became a president later on. So that's a great picture. So Estelle was terrific in those beginning years.
Tell me a little bit about what a workday was like for you, just an average weekday workday.
Let's see. Well, the average workday was, I'd be in the temple. I'd set up schedules for bar mitzvah training. I'd work with I had an assistant then when I first started. And later on, Gail Malkus became my assistant, and she was a dynamo. And then the afternoons, I would meet with parents and kids and teachers. I'd spend a lot of time preparing material for them by setting up a program, recording individual. I set up a whole series of cassettes for the whole year on every Torah and Haftarah portion, because we rearranged that with the rabbi. A lot of meetings, evening meetings, rehearsals. Most of the rehearsals were in the evening. And a lot of time to prepare and to study and to read. That's one of the big problems for every professional, to find time to read and to study. So it was sort of loose. I sometimes wished I had a job where I worked 9 to 5, because if you didn't, you might not come in at 9 o'clock, but you're there until 8 o'clock. So you had to be, and then if a funeral came up, you think you have a day off? You don't. So you're always on call. Well, you're a doctor, you know what that's like. Always on call, you never know. And then you visit a hospital, you hear somebody's sick, and you're trying to get over there. And very interesting, when you'd walk in to visit someone in the hospital, when I would walk in, they'd say, "Did you come just to see me?" No, they were very touched. Now, I might have seen someone else, but most of the time it could be just them in that one hospital, because not every hospital kept a record of Jewish patients. Only Mercy used to do it. And otherwise, if someone didn't tell you, you wouldn't know that a member's in the hospital. So that was always helpful when we knew, because that was one of the most important things I think I did, or any clergy, to visit someone in a hospital. To this day, people will walk up to me and say, "Cantor, you remember you visited me in the hospital?" Now, I may have forgotten, but that was very important to them. Very important part of the pastoral work.
Not all congregations have cantors making pastoral visits or hospital calls. Was that unique to the culture of Congregation Beth Israel?
Well, no, it wasn't. The role of cantor in the Reform movement has grown. When I first started out, it was sort of low key. And then when I lived in Oakland, I did it only if I knew them. The rabbi would do it. And the rabbis had to be comfortable with the role of the cantor. Sometimes they felt that might be stepping into their territory. In Toronto, it was a different ballgame. Rabbi Gunther Plaut broke me in, so to speak. He took me on a tour of the hospitals, and every week I would get down to the hospital. There, they had the list of Jewish patients, and that was a very important part of that week. Now today, I know that all my colleagues are doing the same thing. I was a pioneer. My whole life has been a pioneer. I started in the cantorate, and second graduate in the School of Sacred Music. I opened up pulpits that never had cantors, and the greatest thing, when I left, they hired another cantor. They always hired them after I left. But, and many of them are continuing, and the role of the cantor has grown tremendously. So I feel good about that. For instance, when I watch someone like Arlene Bernstein, I'm proud of her. I mean, she represents the best of the School of Sacred Music. And so I feel I had a part in starting the road.
So we talked a little bit about the weekday. What started to change on Shabbat or Erev Shabbat? What was that day like for you?
Well, Shabbat is always getting ready. You worry about your voice. You worry you don't eat the right food so you won't burp. And you want to be dressed properly, and you want to make sure that everything's in place, your choir, your music, all these things that people assume. They don't know. They only want to know, how did it go? But these are all the things that a cantor, it's more than just a speaker. You're a singer. And a singer worries about his or her voice, learning the music. Am I doing something new? Will my choir be ready? And all these factors are very important. So Friday becomes a little tense. And And then if you have a bar mitzvah kid, a bar bat mitzvah, you're concerned about that young person being ready and not too nervous. You have to assure them. And all these factors play on the Shabbat.
And Sunday was anything but a day off, wasn't it?
Well, Sunday you work with your volunteer choir, or your teaching. And I had the volunteer choir here, and the Third and Laurel, and we had one big room, which later was divided up into offices. And so we grew like an Amish temple. As we grew, we added new rooms. And then we were ready to make the big move here.
I've been a member for about 14 years, and a very special moment at every High Holy Day service that I sense in the room is when you retake the bima to sing.
That's nice.
What was it like from the pulpit of the High Holy Days for this particular congregation, for you?
I mean, ordinary.
What was that experience like?
Well, it was, it's very exciting to sing before 3,000 people. And when I first came here, we only did one service. In Toronto, I used to do double services right through and hire another cantor and choir in another part of the building to do the same thing. And so the Civic Auditorium is a magnificent auditorium. So for me, it was very exciting because I felt then I could do majestic music with a 12-voice professional choir, a superb organist, and I felt that I could bring to this congregation the majesty of Jewish music through my voice, my choice of music, and the talent that's accompanying me. So that was a great feeling. I've done that. That was my goal through my entire career, but this was like the synthesis. I did it in Toronto, and I was able to continue that here.
I learned a little bit about our history from you earlier. You mentioned that Bob McLeod, who's been known to this congregation as our organist and pianist for years, actually started at the congregation in that professional choir that you brought for the High Holy Day services?
Well, he started before I did. He was 16 when he started to sing in a choir here as a semi-professional, and then he grew as a musician. And when I came here, he was singing just on the holy days. And his former wife, a terrific soprano, also sang. And then his musicianship was very important in the growth of our congregation. And then when Ken Fall, I mourn his loss, when he passed away, when he died, Bob was a natural to step in. And so we've been together for my 30 years. And if I have a program to do outside the temple or within, he's my first choice to accompany me.
We were talking about some of the programs you did together and the others that you brought to the temple. I'm gonna show you another picture and see what memories this brings. This is some of your past
Is this a Rorschach?
musical moments. What is that?
Oh, yes. Well, that's a great shot. That's a full orchestra. Are you going to have that on camera? It's a full orchestra. We did as a sermon and song. It's called Haggadah, Search for Freedom. David Amos's orchestra, and we had a church choir and our own choir, and it's a marvelous work. Part of it I have on my CD called Bits of It, telling the story of Passover. It's in English primarily, and it's a marvelous work. But how exciting to stand on that pulpit in Third and Laurel, have an extended platform, seating. They overflowed into the audience. And it's a marvelous, marvelous work. I've performed it in Toronto, in Tulsa, in Los Angeles, and here.
Can I keep jogging your memory with some pictures?
Okay.
Take a look at this one.
Ah, that's right. Well, that was part of our annual composer in residence. Richard Newman is a well-known composer And I had him as our guest. We did all of his works. He did a lot of interesting work with Sephardic and Ladino music. It was a great evening.
This one's a little different. I recognize this woman. She's quite beautiful. Any idea who that is?
Oh, that's my sweetheart. We did a sophisticated Follies. What year was that? 1982. It was a wonderful event. The whole congregation, volunteers from the congregation. We were at the Prado and Balboa Park, and everybody, a lot of people were in it. It was a variety show, and Marcy and I did some duets, and we had a lot of fun. It was a wonderful evening for the congregation. It was a great spirit, and we should do more like that.
You mentioned before being honored by the JCC. I wanted to show you this picture and see if that brings back.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about what that evening was like.
That's our daughter Judith and Marcy and me. And that's the evening here. It was at the 3rd and Laurel, and I was very honored to be selected to be Man of the Year by the JCC.
As you approached your retirement, tell me a little bit about how you felt.
Well, it was a bit of antipathy or anticipation. I was naturally concerned, but I was relieved in a sense. I wasn't sure exactly how I'd fill my time, but I felt that I had it. And my first attempt, now this congregation has never retired a member of the clergy in 150 years. I was the first one that came to them and said, I want to retire. And at the age of 65, we sat down with a committee, and I tried to project what I would expect from the congregation, following the recommendations of the American Conference of Cantors. So then for 2 years, I worked part-time. I dropped the bar mitzvah program and continued most others. Laurie took over from there. And so I was, in a sense, relieved, and yet missed some aspects of it. And, but it worked out fine. I actually have Shabbat at home, and I've been able to get involved in some other things.
Well, about the time you retired came an event that I'll show you a picture of now. I want to see what that might have been like for you to experience.
Oh, that was my retirement bash. That was 91, I think. That was an incredible weekend at the Grand Hotel. Kara Friedman and Helene Schlafman put together a show, and they had 20, 30 people in it. And it was a marvelous weekend. I was highly honored, and it was good for the congregation. You know, when you honor someone, you honor yourself. And Maury Wax, of blessed memory, also celebrated with a wonderful breakfast or brunch at his home. And we had a lot of fun. Some of it is on video. And a lot of people were involved in that show. I mean, it was not just for me, it was terrific. And some of our leaders went on. Jerry Goldberg was in it, and a whole bunch of people who were in the show, and that was the nice part of it.
But they didn't let you stay retired for very long.
Well, yes, the best laid plans of mice and men gang after gley. And things happened. Michael Sternfield left, and they asked me to fill in. I did a Holy Day service again, and even when Deborah Bard was here, they asked me to sort of co-officiate on the pulpit with her, and primarily to sort of serve as another rabbinic or cantorial presence. And I was glad that I could do that because it gave the congregation a sense of continuity. People were very upset. Michael had been here 20 years, and the reasons for his leaving were very upsetting, and they needed someone that they recognized. And I was glad that I retired here and didn't leave, and I was able to serve that function. It gave people a sense of satisfaction, of continuity and comfort, just by being there. In addition, I sang, but it was important to the congregation. So I think it still runs, even as you recall, when I sing at the Holy Days, I do one or two selections. Arlene is gracious enough to invite me. And Ruth Rogo came to me after the Holy Days, and she said, "Your continuity." I thought that was sweet.
You really haven't been able to retire fully even since then. You've been involved in so many ways in the congregation since then. What are some of your memories about the way you've stayed involved since you officially retired?
Well, this coming Thursday, I'm doing a program, a Yiddish program, as you may have heard the rehearsal, and Bonnie Graff asked me to do it. And so I'm not doing too much. I fill in. Once the rabbi called me, he was going out of town, and Arlene was out of town. He asked if I would do a funeral. I think sometimes just showing up is helpful. And I do a lot of Lifecycle events for non-members as well, and occasionally for members because they don't know the new rabbi. And they call me, and I try to refer them to the rabbi, but they're more comfortable with someone they know. So I serve that function as a representative of the congregation. It's not just me. I'm part of the Beth Israel continuum. And I try to, get them into the mainstream here, but I feel it's important that they still feel they're part of the congregation. They're being serviced by the Cantor Emeritus.
One of the events that you were involved with that I remember soon after I joined the congregation was the one I'm going to show you a picture of here.
Yeah, that's one. We had a lot of fun with that. Deborah Bard had a lovely voice, and we did an evening of pop Broadway shows. And that wasn't in the service, but it was a sisterhood, I think, sponsored that. And I did a few things like that. We did a whole evening of Les Mis, and did another one, a bit of Broadway. So that was sort of the fun part, not Jewish per se, but I try to keep it to Jewish composers.
We're sitting in front of these windows that bring back some memories of our home at 3rd and Laurel. I'm just curious, when you visit there, if you were to walk through there, what would those walls say to you?
Well, a lot of memories. 11 years or 13 years there. But we did, in spite of it looks a little run down to me now, but we did some wonderful things there, the whole congregation. So it doesn't matter what the outside is, it's what's inside that happens. And there were some wonderful things that took place. Nadine did some wonderful things. Bonnie Graff came in, the rabbis. It was a very exciting time, but we were splitting at the seams. And I have great memories. The sanctuary is a lovely sanctuary. In fact, I did all kinds of programming there. And when I first came, the lighting was so bad in that sanctuary, I couldn't read my music. And so I looked up at the dome And I said, wow, wouldn't it be great if we had some spotlights up there? And went to the board, and Maury Waxmay, bless his heart, I'll give you the money for it. So we put up spotlights there. So little things like that. We got a new organ. When I first came here, the organ was a Wurlitzer, and it was so bad that I would look up and look to see if there was a monkey on the organist's back. And then Michael and Ken Fall and I went to the board and said, look, we got to get a better organ. And they responded positively.
I remember you telling me board meetings when you first came to CBI looked a lot different than board meetings look now. What did you mean by that?
It was not too, I don't want to cast aspersions upon anyone, but it was sort of haphazard. I wasn't impressed because I came from Toronto, where everything was very organized, very proper. And I was a little concerned after when I first came here, what goes on here? But they grew. Michael, I think, helped them grow, and they're doing a better job. And you're a member of the board, so you know what it's like.
So we moved to this beautiful new campus a few years back. What did that do to you emotionally when you'd spent so many years at the old place?
I walked in awe. You know, if anyone's been to the Third and Laurel and you walk into this facility, oh my God, you know, this is incredible. Is this the same congregation? I mean, it took a little while to get used to it. It's awesome. It's just, the sanctuary is awesome. I love this chapel. And when I saw the stained glass windows, I thought they actually moved them. It was so beautifully captured, that color and design. So I'm very proud of what they've done. The fact that we raised that kind of money, people thought we can't do it. And that's a great lesson.
It doesn't seem like the heart of the congregation has really moved. I remember when we recently celebrated Cantor Arlene Bernstein's 10th year anniversary here, you started out that service. You came up first to lead that service or evening. And the reaction from about 700 people filling every nook and cranny of the sanctuary was pretty amazing. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes. I mean, it was awesome. It was an awesome tribute to Arlene, she's outstanding, and I stand at her feet because she's great, and I was honored to be part of it. And once again, continuity, so important. And this congregation is great. They've come a long way, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Did you sense their feeling about you that evening when you came up?
I did. When I did, it was, I'm always very touched by that. I did my second bar mitzvah the Friday night, and I got a standing ovation. I mean, I was stunned. But once again, I share a lot of wonderful memories with these people. They share with me, and I share with them, and so we have that common bond.
And what's the last birthday you celebrated?
The last birthday?
What was your last birthday? What number?
84.
Mazel tov. And many, many more.
Thank you.
So Cantor Merel, if somebody says Congregation Beth Israel to you, what comes to mind?
I think of a very active, viable, open congregation. And one of the things that I used to say to people when we had too many changes of rabbinic leadership, I would tell them this is a great congregation. We have great staff, and everything's going beautifully. And we will get a more stable in rabbinic leadership. We have a great cantor, a great executive director. That's what's important, and that's what I see here. Now, we have a fine rabbi now, but the meantime, all those people, Bonnie Graff and Arlene, have kept this thing going. It's awesome. And the educational activities, I think we have a wonderful congregation.
If I only gave you one word or one phrase to sum up how you feel about your long history at Congregation Beth Israel, what would you say?
Grateful.
Well, we're very grateful too. Cantor Sheldon Merel, our Cantor Emeritus, beloved friend, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you all for joining us too. I'm Sandy Feldman. Goodbye.